So we are back in part 2 of our Tanking as a Paladin series here. Right now we're over in the Addington area. You'll notice we're in the Brine Works, actually, over in the Stormsong Valley. One of the reasons I wanted to come up here was just to give more of a detailed explanation of how our abilities work, namely the interrupts. And this looks like a good mix between some casters down here and some non-casters. There's also a few pulls that I could do to kind of get a few folks to come together, have some tea and crumpets with me, and just show you some of the ways of crowd control that a protection paladin does have. So what we're going to do is we're going to come on over here, we're going to land, and we're going to start by explaining some of what we have along our bar. Of course, you're welcome to arrange your icons in any particular order that feels more comfortable for you in your rotation. This just so happens to have worked the best for me for many years, but we'll go over the abilities here. First and foremost, instead of the auto attack, I do have the Hammer of the Righteous. This is our primary melee strike. The important thing to note with the Hammer of the Righteous, that as you are standing in your Consecrate, the Hammer of the Righteous does hit all other targets within 8 yards. Now, those targets do not need to be in the Consecration to take a strike. So as an example, if my Consecration is down and I just so happen to be on the cusp and I'm striking a target directly in front of me, and there is a target just a short distance behind him, as long as he is within the 8 yards of me, he will take damage. So you'll notice it says a max of 2 charges. There is just a few second recharge associated with this. That's perfectly fine. We never want to be using auto attack as a paladin, but our Hammer of the Righteous is our primary melee strike, especially as we are standing in our Consecration, because it hits everything within 8 yards in front of us. Now, one of the things I have tested and I can successfully report on is if I am surrounded by those targets, or there are targets similar to the 3 o'clock position, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock position, and I do swing the Hammer of the Righteous, I can confirm that it's all targets are getting struck, even though it is the target that is behind me. It is taking into consideration that there's a target within 8 yards. With that said, our second one is that Shield of the Righteous. As we had mentioned, you want to keep this up as much as possible. There is a countdown timer, you'll notice, in the upper right-hand corner. It starts off with 4 seconds. However, depending on your specs or depending on the attributes you have associated with your specs, it is entirely possible that Shield of the Righteous could be up there for 10 to 12 seconds, or it keeps recharging itself, again, just depending on your specs. So it isn't something you got to sit there and just spam it and then spam it and then spam it. That's not really doing too much, although you'll notice that if you do sit there and spam it, the cooldown timer for it, or actually your utilization timer for that matter, is stacking. So initially, if you were to hit this and get your 4.5 seconds, if you were to just spam it twice, you'll notice it's doubling that time. If you're able to be lucky and spam that 3 times, then you're going to give yourself roughly 11 to 12 seconds worth of Shield of the Righteous goodness. So again, some of your abilities can recharge or prolong the Shield of the Righteous. It's just important to try to keep that up as much as possible. It's not as important in single or just even 2-3 target combat, depending on the mob and their ability. There are already so many micromanagey things with a tanking paladin to keep an eye on, but 9 times out of 10, if you're already standing in your Consecrate, you've smacked somebody with your Shield of the Righteous, and you're just waiting on that cooldown, your average mob is going to be dead within the first few seconds anyway, so it's not as imperative to worry about this if those mobs really are not damaging you much anyway. This is especially useful on boss fights, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Our third ability is our Avenger's Shield, so you get to play a little bit of Captain America here. There are specs you can go into where your Avenger's Shield will hit an additional target. So even though you do see the tooltip mentioning that as you throw it, it hits a target and then 3 additional enemies, that is showing that I'm currently spec'd into hitting a total of 4 targets. By default, if you are not spec'd into that ability or have the essence that allows you to do so, your Avenger's Shield will only hit 3 targets. The Avenger's Shield is very important to note here, and these work very synonymously with one another, just in a very nice synchronicity. With our Shield of the Righteous and our Avenger's Shield, you'll notice the Avenger's Shield increases the effects of the next Shield of the Righteous by 20%. So that goes back to, instead of spamming the living bejesus out of the Shield of the Righteous, you may want to get an Avenger's Shield off first, which also means that when you're in a long combat phase, especially with a boss, use your Avenger's Shield whenever it comes up, followed by your Shield of the Righteous. Obviously, you can see why you would want to do that, because the extra 20% mitigation is incredible. The Judgment, this is just pure damage, but it can also reduce the remaining cooldown of your Shield of the Righteous by 2 seconds or 4 seconds on a crit strike. So whenever your Judgment is available, I do recommend use it, throw it, as it is reducing the cooldown of your Shield of the Righteous, making it more readily to use and allowing you to keep it up more so throughout the fight. Our Rebuke is our interrupt. Our Rebuke will interrupt spell casting and prevent any spell in that school from being cast for 4 seconds. Now, what that means is you could essentially shadow lock an enemy, but if that enemy has the ability to throw fire or frost in addition to the shadow, he will still do so. It is important to note that the Rebuke does not work on some cast abilities. If you do have mods such as Deadly Boss mods installed, it typically will come up with a flash and let you know that you need to interrupt the spell casting of the enemy that you're on. This is especially helpful if you notice that a boss is charging up a blast ability, or there's a mob that is charging up a hex ability and happens to hex your healer, turns him into a pretty little bunny for 8 seconds, but unfortunately you died 7 seconds ago. So interrupts are very important. As a side note, I have wanted to form a guild called Use Your Damn Interrupts, because as a tank, we are always constantly monitoring for the spell casting, but we are limited as to how many interrupts in a short period of time we can throw. We typically do rely on the DPS to do their job, which is to burn down a mob very quickly, but also watch for the mechanics of a boss fight, or watch a mob that could be charging up his lasers for pew pew, and instead of the DPS focusing more on their numbers and their stats and the damage meter, we ask that they use their damn interrupts. Nobody likes to be griefed, and no healer likes to recover from a blast that could have been interrupted, and now the healer must bring everybody above the 20% health they all took 80% damage of, because DPS was too busy tying their shoe. So our Consecrate, self-explanatory. Keep this up at all times. Wherever you are standing, keep it going, even though the Consecrate is down for the 12 seconds and your cooldown can be less than 4. It is a good practice to just throw it down. You're going to have to move a little bit on the fights, but just keep it going. You'll notice kind of what I'm doing here is I'm almost setting up a pathing. And the reason for this is because a lot of the times a tank will use an LOS to pull a mob in other words, used as line of sight. This means if I was to pull that lamppost over there and I was to throw something at him to get his attention, I would throw a Consecrate and run and break the line of sight. This is particularly useful for ranged. If that was an enemy hunter or an enemy caster, that mob would then need to run into me, but through the Consecrate where he is building a current level of threat. So by the time the mob gets over to me, he's already gotten hit by whatever I threw at him, and he's also gotten a couple of doses of Consecrate, which is great for his health. So one of the things I do want to go over with the Consecrate is how you can pull using the line of sight. We'll go over that in another video as we move on to our Hammer of Justice. The Hammer of Justice is different than the Rebuke, as where the Rebuke only has a 15-second cooldown and is primarily responsible for stopping spell casting. The Hammer of Justice will just stop you dead in your tracks. It is not usable on bosses and cannot be used in place of an interrupt on a boss cast. So I want to make that very clear to all the up-and-coming Paladin tanks, that although you do technically have 2 interrupts here, as both can be used on conventional spellcasting, your Hammer of Justice cannot be used to interrupt spellcasting on a boss. If in the event you were to cast your Hammer of Justice on your standard mob, it would render them incapacitated for 6 seconds, meaning they're not only no longer casting, but they're no longer doing anything for 6 seconds. Almost sounds like my personal life. Moving on into the Flash of Light. You're not really going to use this too much. It is important to note some of the tactics that some tanking paladins like to use with their healer, in the sense of when you're grouped up over here, I typically like to set the healer as the focus. And this is what it would look like just with your healer's name here. One of the primary reasons for this is because my hotkeys are currently set up that if I were to hold the Shift key and hit Flash of Light, it would actually heal my focus target. So as a tank, it's our job to make sure the healer has no threat unto them, they're not getting pounded on, they're not taking damage enough to kill them, and we are also to make sure that, well, their overall well-being is just that. So if in the event that we have our focus here and we notice that our healer is taking damage, because our focus hotkey is anything that I hold my Shift key down on and hit, check this out, I can even shield them. So if I'm over here and the healer is behind me and I notice they're dropping, I can very quickly send a bubble their way to drop their threat, make them immune to damage for a little bit, and then I can send a quick Flash of Light or 2 to bring them back up. Healers will typically be sacrificing their own health to make sure the tank is alive or to make sure DPS is alive, but as we've seen in the past, Blizzard hates healers. If you've ever played a healer, you'll know why that is. Excuse me. Primarily because as a healer tries to stand still and throw a heal on somebody, here comes some AoE goop they've got to get out of. This is a quick interpretation of healing in World of Warcraft. I'm going to stand here and heal. Oh, nope, I gotta move. I'm going to stand here and heal. Nope, I've got to move. I'm going to stand here and heal. Nope, gotta move. Oh, the party's wiped. You suck as a healer. Wow, that's the life of a healer in World of Warcraft. So, as a paladin tank, because you have the ability to send some flash heals, you can use this primarily to keep yourself up if you're taking too much damage for a healer to heal through. But keep an eye on your healer, keep them up and going, or if you happen to notice that DPS took a nasty hit at no fault of their own, there's nothing stopping you from just being courteous, clicking on them, and just throwing a quick flash heal their way. The nice thing about having your Consecrate constantly down for that 12 seconds is it is building threat for you, just by them standing in this region. You most likely already have several 100% worth of threat on the target. So taking a break in the action and not hitting that target and healing a couple of times is not going to make you lose threat. just get right back in the fight. Use your Hammer of the Righteous, throw your Avenger's Shield, get your all targets abilities going again, and you'll just rebuild your threat levels. Light of the Protector, there are two ways you can use this. One of them is that you can set it to instantly heal, short of a lay on hands. It can instantly heal a party member for a considerable amount of damage done to them, or you can be greedy and set it to instead it heals you. Now, I've set this for me because there have been countless incidences where I need to break line of sight from the healer, and well, I need to keep myself up if I'm about to drop. It is not the healer's inability to keep me alive, more so as it's something within the mechanic of the fight, or just an ability of over-tuning during a time-walking event and just getting pummeled, or a debuff. There are times where I will have to hit myself with the Light of the Protector. You'll notice that it is increased by 200% based on the missing health. With this, we'll just real quickly jump over here to Avenging Wrath. Avenging Wrath will increase all your damage, healing you receive, and critical strike chance 20% for 20 seconds. But what it does make your Light of the Protector crit heal you. That was roughly for 104,000 damage, but the screen cut that off. This is great to use if you know you're about to take a considerable amount of damage and that you want to make sure that you have a very large and in charge heal ready to rock and roll for you, but also you're getting that 20% increase to healing for that 20 seconds. So you're giving your healer an ability to, well, keep you up and alive. With that said, the ability just to the right of that is the Ardent Defender, followed by the Guardian of the Ancient Kings. The Ardent Defender will reduce all the damage you take by 20% for 8 seconds, and while it is active, the next attack that would otherwise kill you will instead bring you to 20% of your maximum health. If you have timed your pulls right and the engagement right, and you time when to use the Ardent Defender, there are two instances that come to mind. One of them is that you need to jump into a very large mob, and you don't necessarily want to use your I win button over here, but you do want to mitigate as much damage as possible, even if it is only for a few seconds. You're going to pop your Ardent Defender to give you that 20% damage reduction. You're going to pop your Avenging Wrath to give you all damage you deal and all healing you take is increased by 20% for 20 seconds. But you're also going to want to pop Guardian of the Ancient Kings, which reduces all damage you take by 50% for 8 seconds. Now what this has done is your healer, for just roughly between 6 to 10 seconds, does not have to heal you, because all damage you are receiving is reduced by 70%. You have an Avenging Wrath that is active for 20 seconds. But if the fit were to hit the shan and you had to get a heal off on you, well, for 20 seconds, you have a critical Light of the Protector that will bring up, I've had Light of the Protector bring me up over 300,000 health before, and enact almost as well as a lay on hands, taking me to full health. So imagine for a moment, if you will, the group is about to take significant damage due to an AoE boss blast. Your Paladin could start popping the Avenging Wrath, the Ardent Defender, Guardian of the Ancient Kings, and now your healer can focus on the group healing for the rest of the party. You're locked into your healer here to make sure that that blast is not going to take them down. You pop these three, the boss goes off and nukes everybody. You'll take a couple 100,000 points of damage, which you instantly heal with the Light of the Protector. You're still taking 70% damage mitigation here for those 8 seconds, and you could maybe even get a couple of flash heals off to bring your healer back up. But how are you keeping threat on the target if you're willing to just pop all of this, preserve yourself and help off-heal the group? You guessed it, Consecrate. Your Consecrate's 12 seconds. Just come over here and just keep it up. So this ability right here I use time and time again in Mythic runs, where I'm able to just increase all the healing that I do receive for when these two roll off. So I'm getting that extra 20% healing for the roughly 12 seconds. But by that time, the whole party's healed, the healer's back up to where they need to be, I have self-healed, and we are starting fresh on a boss that has started out with his initial AoE blast, but now we've got a full 2 minutes to bring him down before he does it again. Or, if the blast can be interrupted, you can go ahead and fire off the rebuke, or just rely on your DPS to help you rotate what those interrupts are supposed to look like. So we'll go on to our next ability here, which is our Blinding Light. In one quick moment, one step back, I had mentioned there were two things the Ardent Defender. The first one, obviously, your raw damage mitigation. That second one would be if you know a strike is coming, your healer is down, you've got 10% health, the boss is at 1%, and he's going to cleave the living bejesus out of you. You can go ahead and hit your Ardent Defender, that instead of that one strike killing you from the boss, it will bring you up to 20% health, allowing you to get that final blow in. There's a science to using it, but I do recommend practicing with some world mobs of allowing them to take you down to almost death and then use your Ardent Defender just to kind of get an idea of what that 20% of your health looks like and then how much damage you're able to do as a response of getting a second wind. Blinding Light. This is actually kind of a hit or miss with some, and it's debated by many in the Paladin field of what a tanking Paladin should use in the third tier, because you do have Repentance and your Fist of Justice. Real quick, the Fist of Justice is completely useless in my opinion because it's only going to reduce the cooldown of my Hammer of Justice by 6 seconds. Well, my Hammer of Justice only works on non-boss mobs, well, singular for that matter, and allows me to stun a target for 6 seconds, but since I'm a tank, I'm pulling 4 or 5 things at the same time. Repentance, this is amazing for a Retribution Paladin because this gives them crowd control and it forces an enemy target to meditate, capping them for 1 minute. Of course, any damage done to that target will wake that target right back up, and 9 times out of 10, if the tank has not tapped that target, as soon as the target comes out of their meditative state, they're going to go for the person that casts the Repentance on them, or they may even go for the healer. So these two are completely useless as a tanking Paladin. If anybody else tells you any differently, they may need to have their head examined because you are tanking multiple mobs at the same time, and some of those times there are going to be multiple casters. As an example, Tol Dagor. We all know about the fish people and their bubbles. I hate that water bubble that they cast because they'll just sit there, spam it, and it adds minutes onto the fight. By the Blinding Light, this gives you an AoE interruption that blinds all enemies within 10 yards, causing them to wander disoriented. Non-holy damage breaks the disorient effect. Get this, as a tanking Paladin, you decide you're going to lay the law down, and you're going to activate your Blinding Light. They're still walking in your Consecrate. They're taking damage. You hit them with your Hammer of the Righteous, which is holy damage. They're still walking around aimlessly. The only thing that's interrupting them or waking them from their 6-second stun is non-holy damage. So think about that for a moment, that you really could turn the tides of battle, or you could really lock down a couple of casters for a few seconds, generate a lot of threat onto them with your Consecration, your Avenger's Shield, your Hammer of the Righteous, and then have your melee and your ranged DPS come in after that 6 seconds of building up threat and damaging them significantly. The blinding light cooldown is only roughly 1.5 minutes, and it does function as an interrupt if in the event you've got to get one off, and Rebuke is just on cooldown. It is important to note that because blinding light is a stun and not an interrupt, or this is more of a disorient, not a stun, sorry, because this is a disorient and not an interrupt, if the mob is immune to crowd control, the mob will be immune to the blinding light. But the majority of the mobs that you will face in an instance will be impacted by this blinding light, at least giving you a couple of seconds to reorient yourself and figure out the strategy to burn down those casters while your Rebuke comes back online. Your cleanse toxins. Folks, I've had a lot of people ask me as a paladin, why aren't you clearing my curse? I'm cursed, I'm this, I'm that, but I'm here to tell you paladins can only do poison and disease. There was a time we used to be able to do magic, but we cannot do it anymore. Stop asking us to do it. I know that you're cursed, but it was really kind of embarrassing that one of the people that was yelling at me in one of my live streams was a mage yelling at the fact that he was cursed, not realizing he could decurse himself. I don't know why. So, with that said, you do have the ability to cleanse friendly targets, removing all poison and disease effects. Keep in mind, however, this is an 8-second cooldown, and it is only singular. The reason it did not burn that cooldown is because if you attempt to cleanse a target that has nothing on it, it will not burn the spell. And I love that, because there have been times in the past with previous expansions that I have gone to burn an ability and it's not applicable to the target, but then all of a sudden this is burned and now I am incredibly sad as a result of it. With this said, I run a mod called Decursive, and it's actually sitting right here. Now, under normal conditions, I would see everybody that was in my party on the left-hand side. I would see any debuffs on them that I could remove. However, sometimes it's more of a pain in the rear to interrupt what I'm doing with my movement and my engagement with a boss or a regular mob. Come down here, click Cleanse Toxin, and then select somebody, or deselect them and then click Cleanse Toxin. That can become very confusing. The Decursive add-on will give you a square for each player in your party. So you typically have 5 squares across the bottom. Whenever an ability triggers, or whenever a debuff hits one of your party members that you can dispel, all you have to do is highlight their cube and click it. Now, right now, there's nothing to cure because I'm not tainted with anything. However, this is applicable for all classes. If you're a mage, if you're a priest, if you're a druid, paladin, anybody that has a decurse or cleanse ability, the decursive mod allows you to just look at that person through the square here and just touch their name, and it automatically takes your cleanse ability and removes it from them. There's also a countdown timer inside of that box as well. So I would normally see all 5 players here and how everybody is currently tainted with something dispellable by me. I would then click primarily the healer, if at all possible, because I can mitigate a little bit more than the healer. As I would click the healer, I would then notice a countdown timer of 8 seconds, because that's what the cooldown of my cleanse toxins is. So get yourself Decursive mod, and start learning the fabulous ways of loving your healer and mitigating damage by being able to cleanse and take care of abilities, debuff abilities on your own. The next thing over here is one of our more important features. It is the Hand of Reckoning. It does command the attention of an enemy target, forcing them to attack you. It's our taunt. I have been asked when I've shown my bar to several folks of why my taunt is way the blazes over here and not more across the front. And put simply, protection paladins generate a lot of threat. It's very rare that we have to taunt a target unless DPS decides that, hey, He opened up by throwing a hammer at the guy, so I'm going to open up with a nuclear missile. Then you may have to taunt the target away after you let DPS get beat into submission to teach them the old lesson of if you spank it, you tank it. So this primarily comes in handy on boss fights where the tank is stunned or some level of disorient. When a tank is disoriented in combat, the mob will typically go to the second highest person on the threat meter. It is almost always the healer, so keep an eye out for that, DPS. But as a tank, it's very important that when your disorient ability is gone, spam that taunt. 9 times out of 10, they're going to retrain back on you, but just get that taunt ready and try to get those targets back in line. It's also not a bad idea that, if you are helping to off-heal or you are doing other mechanics of your class, on occasion, throw a taunt at the boss if it's taking 20 years to bring the guy down. Of course, one of our favorites is the Divine Steed. Get to activate that and just do a quick run. This especially comes in handy if you're in King's Rest, as an example, and you're up against one of those big smashing mobs where the AoE effect starts to fill the screen, and you kind of run out of that, or you're going to get catapulted into the air and land. One of a quick point of mention with that, by the way, is if you are going to self-heal yourself with the Light of the Protector, don't heal yourself when you've been catapulted into the air. Heal yourself after you land, or you're going to burn it, waste it, completely useless. I've seen a lot of paladins go airborne and immediately cast it, only to land and lose half of their health. Just wait till you land, and then burst it up. The Blessing of Spell Warding. I do have this as a replacement, for my Blessing of Protection, because the Blessing of Spell Warding grants immunity to magical damage and those harmful effects for 10 seconds. The Blessing of Protection does not necessarily mean that your healer or a party member is going to be immune to magic damage or an AoE blast of shadow damage. So I am opting to use the Blessing of Spell Warding to give better protection unto a party member than having 2 charges of Divine Steed, and the second one may be cool, or the Retribution Aura, where it's like me and my allies within 60 yards, we're protected by an aura that will lash out, dealing holy damage to any melee attacker. This can be cool in ways of helping to support damage that is being done to your party, but keep this in mind right here. It's not going to do enough to really make a difference, as opposed to having this additional boost of Blessing of Spell Warding for when the fit hits the shan. So if you're damage light, I guess you might be able to run with Retribution Aura, but personally, I've never been in a group where Retribution Aura was going to make or break a fight. It just wasn't worth it. I've been in groups where the Blessing of Spell Warding has saved us more times than I can count. And then, of course, our magical I Win Divine Shield button. This is the greatest thing since sliced bread. But keep in mind, there are 2 ways you can use your Divine Shield. If you are not spec'd into Final Stand, don't use Divine Shield if you are surrounded by a mob or a boss, because you're going to be immune to all damage for 8 seconds. That's great, but you drop all threat when you activate it, which means your DPS and your healer who are sitting back there like, I'm doing what I can to help you out, or your healer's struggling to keep you awake and alive, you pop that shield, well, guess what? They all leave you alone, and they go say what's up to your healer, and then your healer needs to go for those several years of therapy. I'm sure you're beginning to see a pattern here of how the tank and the healer have a relationship, and we need to keep it healthy, as opposed to more of a Jerry Springer-ish of, hey baby, I love you, but I'm taking care of myself, and the mobs go and one-shot your healer. So when you spec into Final Stand, and I do recommend, yes, spec into Final Stand, when you use Divine Shield, you taunt all the targets within 15 yards to come and get to you. Most likely, you already have all the targets on you, but this reaffirms your threat. So for those 8 seconds, your DPS could be putting out the absolute best of the best and nuking the living bejesus out of something. And those targets are not going to turn around. Or for that matter, if you have targets that are just a few yards outside of your range and they happen to be sniping your healer or sniping other members of your party by activating your shield while having final stand, all of those taunts or that taunt will actually impact them. So instead of those 8 seconds randomly sniping party members, they're now focused on you. 8 seconds is a long time when you're trying to recover from a wipe. Just for the sake of argument, we'll look at the other 2 pieces here. Hand of the Protector. This is what allows you to heal the friendly target, as opposed to you being selfish with your Light of the Protector. No, you have Lay on Hands for this reason. Trust me, you want your own self-healing capabilities. And then, of course, the Unbreakable Spirit reduces the cooldown of your Divine Shield, your Ardent Defender, and, of course, your Lay on Hands by 30%. Well, last but not least, as far as the more regularly used Paladin abilities here, the Lay on Hands, healing a friendly target for an amount equal to my maximum health. Currently, I'm sitting at 576,000 health. When I'm fully buffed, it's roughly close to 800,000. So when I use my Lay on Hands, you're going to get between a 700 and 800,000 point heal in many instances that I run. This will put forbearance on the target for 30 seconds, so you cannot cast a Lay on Hands on a target and then shield them, or vice versa for that matter. You cannot shield a target and then immediately Lay on Hands them. This is where you have to keep an eye on your healer. You can shield them, a couple of flash heals, and go right back into the fight with where you were. There are a few other Paladin abilities, such as the Blessing of Sacrifice. You can bless a party or raid member, reducing the damage they take by 30%, but you suffer 100% of that damage prevented. This will last 12 seconds, or until transfer damage would cause you to fall below 20% health. You could experiment, and you could use the Blessing of Sacrifice with the Ardent Defender, knowing that the Blessing of Sacrifice may end up killing you, but remember, it's anything that would kill you would instead take you to 20% health. This is a very sensitive mechanic to use. I would not recommend it. In fact, I don't recommend using Blessing of Sacrifice at all in your conventional runs. It has done me absolutely no good and has instead put more stress on a healer who really at the end of the day shouldn't be taking that much damage from threat, because as a tank you should be controlling the flow of battle. Your Blessing of Freedom, this can come in handy if someone is stuck or you. Because you're pulling so many mobs into you, you're most likely to be snared or slowed down. The Blessing of Freedom does grant immunity to any movement impairing effect for 8 seconds, but then as soon as it wears down, you could be re-snared or frozen in place or just completely slowed down. Question I've been asked regarding the Blessing of Freedom is, wouldn't it have made more sense to go Cavalier so you could use that to get out of a sticky situation? True, but again, the Blessing of Spell Warding is a lot better if in the event somebody breaks off and starts beating on your healer or a DPS party member. So some of the other things that I'm sure you've seen down here, is Every Man for Himself. This is just a racial ability as a human. Removes all stun effects. This does come in handy. And then, of course, I've got an Animus of Death that I'm running as one of my essences, that if I were to activate this, everybody takes some damage, all enemies for that matter, and then I gain a percentage of that damage as healing. So these are not standard issue, which is why we just more so went over the abilities down here. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a pause. We're going to rejoin at our location here, get into some combat, and show you how all of this works. definitely appreciate your time, your patience on this. And of course, I will just point out for those purists and the like that, of course, there's a few other paladin abilities, but just in case you may need it, here's your redemption. So you can res somebody outside of combat. And no, paladins do not have a battle res, so I really wish some folks would stop asking me if they do. We do not. So we will be right back with the recording on how to use these abilities in action.